Helicopters truly defy the laws of physics. Conquering vertical flight, is not an obvious thing.
The helicopter is hundreds of thousands of moving parts, flying in formation at 15,000 feet.
Whenever you're using a helicopter, it's for a darn good reason. It's always got a sense of urgency attached to it.
One of the most innovative helicopters, the tandem helicopter, was absolute genius.
And the gentleman responsible was Frank Piasecki. Piasecki gets credit for really the first successful large helicopter ever built.
He was the catalyst, the person who showed that it was possible.
Frank Piasecki is the true pioneer of the rotorcraft industry. That early tandem rotor helicopter was successful in its own right, but led to the Chinook, which is one of the most successful helicopters that's ever been built. And it was because he was challenging what everybody else accepted were the limits of the helicopter.
Helicopters are often described as the stepchild of aviation. The early pioneers are attempting to build these machines. They can get off the ground maybe a few feet, but they're not stable, they're not really controllable. They lack the efficiency necessary to be a practical aircraft.
The concept of vertical lift, of taking off and landing vertically, proved to be a more complex problem than the challenge of powered horizontal flight. At the start of the 20th century, the Wright brothers demonstrated their aircraft inspired by soaring birds. Helicopters had no model in nature for its developers to study and emulate.
The first really significant breakthrough for rotorcraft occurs in Spain, and the gentleman responsible was Juan de la Cierva.
In 1923, de la Cierva successfully flew a design he called the autogyro. It looked similar to a fixed-wing airplane, but with the innovation of an unpowered rotor atop the plane. When the engine was cut, it could safely and gradually descend almost vertically.
When the autogyro hit the market, it created a real sensation. This was something that people hadn't seen before. It was very exotic. It could take off and land in fairly short distances in quite confined spaces. It couldn't hover, but it could fly very slowly.
In 1929, the Philadelphia-based airplane manufacturer Pitcairn acquired the patent to the autogyro and began manufacturing the machines, making Philadelphia the hub of autogyro production and the future center of the rotorcraft industry.
Philadelphia was an industrial city, but it had a lot of engineering schools around, so we were a high-tech city.
It was very natural that Philadelphia would be the Silicon Valley of the helicopter.
Frank Piasecki was born in 1919 in the city that would become the cradle of rotorcraft.
He came from a very simple family, not educated but smart, very recent Polish immigrants.
Like so many children growing up in the 1920s, Frank was captivated with aviation. He was 10 years old when autogyros began to take flight in Philadelphia.
A familiar sight would be an autogyro landing to deliver mail. It must have inspired him.
Frank was a violinist, a photographer, an excellent student, and consumed with building model airplanes.
In high school, he worked for Kellett on the factory floor. The chief pilot said to him, "Listen, kid, I've heard you're a photographer. If you come and do these photos for me, I'll give you a ride in my autogyro.
By virtue of the wind, the pilot was able to land the autogyro vertically. That's what captured his imagination. The freedom to be able to fly vertically.
The unpowered rotor on the autogyro only allowed it to descend vertically, but Frank was fascinated. He committed to study engineering and aeronautics, first at the University of Pennsylvania and then at New York University. In 1939, while Frank was in his senior year of college, the first viable American helicopter was demonstrated.
The first true helicopter in the United States was built by Igor Sikorsky.
Igor Sikorsky was a towering figure in aviation. Born in the Russian Empire in 1899, he designed bombers for the Tsar's army during World War I. He fled his homeland after the Russian Revolution in 1919 and settled in America. 4 years later, he opened his own aircraft manufacturing company. Admired as an engineering genius, he continued to design fixed-wing planes, but also turned his attention to vertical flight. The concept of lift is the most basic principle of flight. For an aircraft to fly, it must create a force that overcomes gravity. Lift is the result of air flowing under and over the wings. A helicopter's blades function like wings, spinning to generate airflow above and below the blades to lift the helicopter upward. But helicopters deal with another phenomena known as torque that spins the body of the helicopter below in the opposite direction of the rotor. Sikorsky's solution was to have a small vertical rotor on the tail, countering the torque, stabilizing the aircraft.
When Igor Sikorsky is starting to perfect his first practical helicopter, the VS-300, it was appearing in all sorts of periodicals and on the newsreels. And when people saw the helicopter in action, they started to see a vehicle of the future. Sikorsky certainly fed this vision. This created something of a helicopter craze in the United States.
My father could feel the burgeoning excitement. He had been watching Sikorsky working on his single-rotor helicopter, but he knew that there was a lot more to explore and a lot of technical issues that had to be solved.
He said vertical takeoff and landing opens up such incredible freedom of operation. I think he wanted to genuinely push the boundaries.
And helicopter development was about to gain momentum as the American military began preparations for what many believed would be the inevitable entry of the United States into the Second World War. The military applications of the helicopter now drove its development. In 1940, at the age of 21, Frank Piasecki graduated from college with a degree in aeronautical engineering. He took a job as a junior engineer at Philadelphia-based Platt-Lepage, which had a contract with the military to develop a large helicopter. The job brought Piasecki into contact with engineers who had been exploring vertical flight for years.
My father became good friends with his boss, Elliot Daland.
Elliot Daland had a mind that showed all kind of brilliance, but he was virtually blind, legally blind, and read his drawings with a jeweler's eyeglass. Frank was assigned to him as sort of Elliot Daland's eyes.
Elliot would say, "Frank, tell me what the whole drawing says." So he'd literally start on one side of this very technical drawing and have to explain very detailed mechanical and electrical systems. And that challenged him at that age. But that ability to verbalize what the technology did and how it worked was essential to his future.
Working with Dalen deepened his skills as an engineer. Piasecki noticed a flaw in the Platt-Lepage design that could cause the pilot to lose control of the aircraft. The young engineer shared his concerns in a memo to Mr. Lepage. Lepage ignored Piasecki and his memo.
It was going to be very dangerous. He had a relationship with the pilot, and he was concerned for his life.
Frank warned the pilot.
First flight test day came. The Army was there, the press was there, and they took off at about 100 or so feet. The helicopter started banking over to one side, went up, and then came down, hard landing.
With Piasecki's warning, the pilot was able to save himself and the aircraft.
The pilot got out of the helicopter, moved everybody aside, and came right to my dad and put his arm around him and said, "Thanks, kid."
He'd figured the problem out, saw a fix, presented it, and was rejected by Lepage, and that challenged him to do it himself.
That day, Dad submitted his resignation.
Frank resigned from Platt-Lepage and turned his full attention to what had been a side project he had been working on nights and weekends. It was a project that would launch the young Frank Piasecki as a rival of the legendary Igor Sikorsky. Platt-Lepage was Frank Piasecki's day job, and it came to an abrupt end with his resignation. But it was never his only pursuit. The PV Forum was a band of young engineers who spent nights and weekends working on engineering the future.
There are these young guys, most of whom were just out of university.
They all had day jobs, so they had the freedom to work after their day jobs and start this new thing, PV Engineering Forum.
The P stood for Piasecki, who was the clear leader of the group.
There was always spirit around my father. He had incredible charisma, technical discipline, and his ability to garner a group of people and get them really excited about an end vision was unbelievable.
The PV Forum wanted to build a helicopter from scratch, but lacked an experienced lead engineer. Piasecki asked his former mentor, Elliot Dalen, to collaborate. And to the forum's surprise, the much older Dalen agreed.
Developing the helicopter was hugely risky for him and his colleagues. They were coming from behind, they were self-funded, they didn't have any contracts, and they were starting after Sikorsky.
Like Sikorsky's machine, the forum's design had a single rotor on top and a small tail rotor. They designated it the PV-2. Piasecki and the PV Forum set out to build a prototype.
The parts were from different sources. The very critical parts had to be made with great care. There are other parts that are not particularly critical, and we would search for it in any junkyard.
They used various parts from other aircraft. They scrounged. It was wartime, so you actually could not buy some of these materials.
The fuselage was salvaged from a derelict airplane, the clutch from a junkyard Chevrolet, an oil pump from an old Packard.
It was a Frankensteinian sort of amalgamation of different aircraft.
On April 11th, 1943, they had a craft that was ready to fly, or at least attempt to fly. Frank assumed the role of test pilot.
He was not a test pilot. He hadn't flown a helicopter, not surprisingly, because there was really only one other helicopter in the country at the time. Like the Wright brothers, there's no one around to teach you, so you kind of have to do it yourself. He taught himself to fly a helicopter.
With Frank at the controls, the Forum flight tested their PV-2.
He loved it. He said that little helicopter was a very sprightly little machine that could maneuver on a dime.
The flight was a milestone. The Forum was only the second developer of a viable helicopter in the United States. Sikorsky had competition. Frank's enthusiasm and salesmanship made him the undisputed face of the PV Forum.
Frank appeared almost every day dressed as he felt a CEO should dress. He wore a mustache to try to gain a more mature look, knowing that he was facing some industrial giants out there and he had a lot to overcome.
Frank had an obvious role model, Igor Sikorsky. The mustache, the Homburg hat, the suit, the outfit of an older man. Frank was 24. But he was every bit as skillful at courting the press.
After this war, there'll be a helicopter in every garage. Saturday mornings, Papa will throw in his golf bag, take off the brakes, step on the gas, and away he goes like a pinwheel on a goldfish bowl.
Dad was the young, brash entrepreneur. He was a showman and had a lot of fun.
Hey, mister, 3 gallons.
In the movie tone film, the big joke was that the helicopter couldn't take off with a full tank of gas, a pilot, and the golf club, so one of them had to go.
The idea of a helicopter in every garage was exciting, but a fantasy with America at war. The immediate future of all helicopter development and of the PV-2 would be in the hands of the military. The Navy agreed to a demonstration of the PV-2 outside of Washington, D.C. The problem for Piasecki and the PV Forum was how to get their helicopter 150 miles south to D.C. The PV-2 had never traveled more than 10 miles in the air, and they couldn't afford a flatbed truck.
We literally hitched it to the back of a Studebaker and towed it from Philadelphia down to Washington, D.C. Bit of a challenge because the wheels were really only to move it around by hand. Big adventure just to move the helicopter down to Washington, D.C.
In October 1943, just shy of 24 years old, Frank Piasecki would be the one to fly and sell the Navy on the PV-2.
You wouldn't suspect that somebody 24 years old was coming to you with this fully developed product that you believed and he caused you to believe was going to change the industry.
Being a salesman is a very important part of who he was. You have to believe in yourself if you're going to convince people to take a chance on something new.
The Navy was impressed, but they asked the question many would ask: what can we use a helicopter for? The helicopter was a solution in search of a problem. Prior to 1943, the Navy did not see a use for a helicopter. But events in the North Atlantic would change that. American ships crossing to supply England with food and weapons were being tormented and sunk by packs of German submarines called U-boats.
There was not an easy solution to locate those U-boats and then attack them. One of the ideas was using the helicopter. You could put some depth bombs on it, at least chase off the submarines, if not actually kill them.
But no existing helicopter could carry the weight of a 2,000-pound torpedo.
The PV-2 could hardly lift my father, who was flying it.
What was needed was an enormous leap beyond the PV-2. Helicopter technology was in its infancy. Most, including the Navy, thought the aircraft that they envisioned would be years in the making.
Dad went directly back to the drawing board.
He studied a myriad of the designs that worked and didn't work and came up with a design he could bring to them.
Only months after his first meeting with the Navy, Piasecki returned with his design for the world's first heavy-lift helicopter. His proposal was rejected. The Navy did not believe Piasecki's design could be built and told him so.
The Navy was doing everything it could to try and get out from any sort of obligation to develop helicopters. This ultimately failed because Senator Truman's Defense Investigation Committee decided that the helicopter was an important solution to the U-boat menace.
Formed in 1941, the Truman Committee was a special Senate committee chaired by then-Senator Harry S. Truman to oversee the U.S. military's war production plans. The committee saw the potential of vertical flight and forced the Navy's hand. The Navy was ordered to develop a large helicopter.
It's the U.S. Navy acting out of desperation. The design that Piasecki had proposed was a large helicopter, something that had never been built before. The Navy officials had the full expectation that he was going to fail.
Finally, on January 1st, 1944, the PV Forum received a contract from the Navy calling for the construction of the first prototype of a large transport helicopter. What followed was months of round-the-clock effort. The workforce expanded to 80 employees. They moved to a new factory. Frank was involved in every decision.
Dad was the test pilot, and that close connectivity, flying the product right back to the design engineers, and that quick iteration is what enabled his team to develop aircraft in such rapid speed.
Piasecki's concept solved many of the problems that plagued the helicopter. It had two main rotors, one over the cockpit and one over the tail, so it allowed for a larger fuselage that could carry more men and supplies. With the rotors turning in opposite directions, they countered the effects of each other's torque, and two rotors produced greater lift, so that the helicopter could carry the loads the Navy needed.
That allowed for the scaling up of the helicopter into a useful machine.
They called their prototype the dog ship.
Typically, rotorcraft development spans a long time, 3 years, 4 years.
From contract signing on New Year's Day to first flight was about 13 months.
The dog ship was rolled out in March 1945. With no outer skin, open to the elements, Frank and a co-pilot made the first test flight.
Piasecki gets credit for really the first successful large helicopter ever built.
The PV Forum had gone from the PV-2, which could barely hold the pilot, to a large helicopter that could hold 8 to 10 passengers and carry nearly 2,000 pounds. No longer just a prototype, it was designated the HRP-1.
It really opened people's eyes at that time. The light bulb kind of finally went off in the United States Navy that, okay, there really is a use for this thing.
The military was very interested in using it. The problem is they looked at this young kid and his band of compatriots and they said, well, how are you guys going to build a fleet of helicopters?
Frank and the PV Forum needed an influx of cash. Frank was introduced to Lawrence Rockefeller and Felix DuPont, two of the wealthiest men in America. With a guaranteed order from the Navy, they were willing to invest in a company led by a 26-year-old engineer with no business experience. But they had a condition. They would own 51% of the company, and they would have control.
At this stage of the career for Frank to have given up control of the company to outside forces, that was always questionable. But it was the need for the money and the need for the credit lines that would come from that caused him to take that step forward.
Frank accepted. The company was renamed Piasecki Helicopter Corporation. Frank became CEO and chairman of the board. With the Navy's initial order of 10 HRP-1s, it was now the only company in the world in the business of building heavy-lift tandem rotor helicopters. In 1945, as World War II came to an end, the U.S. military looked for lessons to be learned from years of combat.
The traditional amphibious assault, the D-Day style assault, they never wanted to repeat. Enormously difficult to achieve, huge loss of life involved. They looked at the problem as one that could be solved by the helicopter. The helicopter could allow them to bypass these types of enemy strong points, hop over the forces or go around them.
The Marines developed a new concept they called vertical envelopment, which incorporated helicopters into military doctrine. It was made possible in part by the heavy lift capacity of Frank Piasecki's tandem rotor helicopter.
Yesterday's Marines took beachheads by water. Today's Marines hit them from behind in helicopter hops from the sky.
Between 1949 and 1950, the Marines showcased vertical envelopment at their base at Quantico, Virginia. Senators, high-ranking military officials, and President Truman all observed the new capability of the helicopter. The demonstration included a mock assault using a fleet of HRP-1s that illustrated how Marines and their equipment could be flown from aircraft carriers to behind enemy lines. It was the doctrine of vertical envelopment that ignited the demand for the tandem rotor helicopter. With backing from his investors, Piasecki met the demand by expanding the workforce and building new facilities. The military responded with a succession of new contracts.
They were growing very rapidly. They were generating a lot of cash. Dad and his fellow founders of the company were very interested in reinvesting that cash into expanding operations and new technologies and the next generation of the helicopter.
Piasecki was always for new ideas. You know, he's 2 steps ahead.
Dad saw this as a race. This was just in the first iteration of the helicopter, and there was so much more to do.
Almost as soon as one helicopter was finished, Frank began designing another. He was dedicated to constantly developing the next machine. He said, "By building a better helicopter faster than the others, we will continue to lead the industry in the transport helicopter field." In 1945, a request from the Navy put Frank in direct competition with his role model, Igor Sikorsky. The contract called for a smaller helicopter that could be stowed below the deck of an aircraft carrier. Both companies submitted designs.
Sikorsky put forward a classic single rotor, main rotor, tail rotor type configuration. Both of the machines had the same engine.
My father thought about the ship environment and the captain of a ship who basically doesn't want a helicopter on its deck. How can this helicopter be stowed efficiently and get off the deck very quickly?
An aircraft carrier needs to clear its deck to launch and recover airplanes. Taking a long time to stow the helicopter was unacceptable.
Piasecki's solution was to build his tandem rotor with overlapping blades that could be folded. It was called the HUP.
One of the most critical design features was its ability to fold its rotors and get below deck quickly.
The HUP easily won the contract and went into service in 1949, performing rescue and general transportation duties.
He always spent a lot of time with the customer, embedded in their operations, really trying to understand what are the problems that I have to solve. And that was the mission.
This string of successes was capped by the production of another large capacity helicopter, the H-21. It was developed for the Air Force for extreme cold mountain rescues and was also adopted by the Army. Only 32 years old, Frank Piasecki had taken his company from the PV-2 to the H-21 in just under a decade. He was the force and the energy behind the growth. He was the face of the company, appearing at events large and small, extolling the possibilities of rotorcraft and Piasecki helicopter. But behind the scenes, success was not what it seemed.
So while Piasecki was clearly a star in terms of helicopter design, the day-to-day management of the company was really not in his wheelhouse.
He was an engineer, and quite often engineers do not make the best CEOs. When you take a business from inventing things to producing things, they're different skills.
He didn't really have an interest in running a manufacturing company. His entire life focus was designing and improving design.
That created a major philosophical difference between Frank and the Rockefellers, because Frank's feeling about bottom line results were they should be reinvested in the furtherance of technology.
With only 49% ownership, Frank had effectively ceded control of the company to investors Rockefeller and DuPont a decade earlier. The repercussions of that decision were about to unfold. With the investors focused on profit and Frank staunchly dedicated to design and development, the factions were in conflict. In 1955, Frank Piasecki was removed as chairman of the board of Piasecki Helicopter, effectively forcing him out of the company he had founded. The name was changed to Vertol for vertical takeoff and landing.
It was very, very traumatic. You could see the depression he had. And we know we're leaving behind one of the best developments we could ever have engineered, which is a tandem. Frank didn't fight that part of it.
Piasecki's departure from the company he founded and which he had brought to a leadership role in the American helicopter industry was undoubtedly an enormous heartbreak for him. And certainly his inventive genius was going to be quite restless.
He always was looking around the corner, the next big thing. Be as close to the next big thing as you possibly can. His second corporate creation, Piasecki Aircraft, focused on new missions and new markets.
He established Piasecki Aircraft in 1955. Once again, it was the military that backed him, asking him to do what he did best: imagine the next big thing. The company was awarded an Army contract to develop a flying jeep capable of vertical takeoff and landing. It utilized ducted fan technology, two rotors, both enclosed in the body of the jeep, that produced lift, propelling the craft upward. It could rise to 200 feet or skirt the ground. Piasecki hoped it would appeal beyond the military.
Everybody was going to have a helicopter in their garage. That was the George Jetson vision that he had. The Air Jeep really was that machine.
He built the Air Jeeps and he built other things like that all were efforts to try and take the benefits of vertical takeoff and landing and take them to a broader market.
Piasecki believed the next step in the evolution of helicopters was traveling longer distances at faster speeds.
All helicopters did not really do very well in forward flight. Dad was very concerned about their ability to do productive work at longer distances. So he developed the world's first shaft-driven compound helicopter.
Piasecki's compound helicopter was called the Pathfinder. It was a helicopter with the speed of a fixed-wing aircraft. It had a standard overhead rotor and small, low-mounted wings with a large ducted fan in the rear. The aircraft could reach speeds over 200 miles an hour.
He wanted to push past the limit on the speed of a helicopter, taking the idea of being able to take off and land vertically, but use it in different ways.
Frank continued to push boundaries. In 1958, he debuted an unmanned aerial machine with 4 rotors developed for shipboard use to deliver weapons. It was called the Seabat.
He was exploring the use of unmanned helicopters to do missions that were dull, dangerous, dirty.
And today, that configuration, the 4-rotor drone, is the most popular aircraft in the world. And he was thinking about it in the 50s, flying and thinking about it in the 50s.
He was clearly ahead of his time. He advocated for it within the Pentagon. And at that time, the helicopter was new, and they were dealing with the helicopter. And the Seabat was just a step too far.
But that was always where Frank wanted to be.
Growing up with him and walking in the halls of the Pentagon, there were constantly people who would be coming up to him and saying, "Frank Piasecki, it's such an honor to meet you. You're a real pioneer." After one of these occasions, he turned to me and he said, "John, do you know what being a pioneer is? It's like being in the Old West. You're the one that gets all the arrows in the rear end. You're learning all the hard lessons that hopefully other people will benefit from."
Not that many people know the contributions that he made. He played a pivotal role in those early years of perfecting the practical helicopter. And he really made the helicopter what it is today.
Piasecki's design, the tandem rotor, never stopped evolving. Vertol was acquired by Boeing in 1960, putting even more resources behind the design.
That tandem rotor design was very easily scalable, so as soon as you got bigger engines, you could start to have bigger helicopters. What Piasecki had done was to make the helicopter truly a utility tool.
In 1961, H-21 helicopters, developed in Frank's last years with Piasecki helicopter, began arriving in a small Southeast Asian country where a murky conflict was taking shape. The U.S. was unofficially there as military advisors to the South Vietnamese.
We would fly them to where they thought there was an enemy force to engage. There was only one highway, essentially. There wasn't really any way to get to the war without the helicopter.
As the U.S. military slid into war, Boeing Vertol was nearing completion of the next generation of tandem helicopters. They are Frank Piasecki's legacy. In the early 1960s, Boeing Vertol unveiled two tandem utility helicopters, the Chinook for the Army and the smaller Sea Knight for the Navy and the Marines. Both were derived from Frank's original design. As the U.S. began to actively engage in combat against the Viet Cong, all services relied on the helicopter for transport, communications, and firepower.
Vietnam is known as the helicopter war because the helicopter was the central instrument of American policy in that conflict. Operations were centered on these bases that were run out of remote areas, a series of bases that were connected not by roads, but by an air bridge using helicopters. The Chinook was the mainstay of that logistical air bridge.
The first Chinooks in Vietnam were able to lift 10,000 pounds. There was nothing like it.
You could lift field artillery pieces into a fire base. You could bring all the supplies necessary to keep a battalion fed and watered with only a few trips. That was a very important capability.
Nearly 750 Chinooks would fly in Vietnam.
We had more damn helicopters than you could shake a stick at. They were all over the place. My job was aircraft recovery. We would go out to where an aircraft had been shot down, and we would get it ready for a lift out by a Chinook. They would pull it out and take it back home for repair. I participated in the recovery of 9 helicopters in one day. The helicopter made all the difference in the world. There is no other way they could have fought that war.
Vietnam was a defining moment for the helicopter. The potential of vertical lift changed the nature of combat.
Infantry doesn't walk anymore. They're carried to war.
Versions of the Chinook will be the first helicopter in the U.S. military to be in service for 100 years.
It just continues to deliver more and more value, most recently in Afghanistan, and that design is so well suited to that very high altitude operation.
The Chinook, over its lifetime, has had some pretty incredible jumps in capability.
Today's Chinooks carry up to 24,000 pounds and can reach speeds of 185 miles an hour.
One of the great uses of the helicopter has been the humanitarian role.
The Chinook is deployed around the world to rescue people, transport food, water, and life-saving supplies in extreme circumstances.
He would definitely be proud to see the Chinook operating today. He was very, very focused on the end goal, and he never looked backwards. He always had hope. And yes, there were disappointments along the way. But as he would tell us, don't let any of those stop you from reaching your dream.
4 of Frank's 7 children work in the aerospace industry. His daughter, Nicole, is a vice president at Boeing Commercial Airplanes. His youngest son, Michael, founded Dragonfly Pictures, which specializes in industrial drones, many designed for the motion picture industry. Sons Fred and John continue to run Piasecki Aircraft Corporation, founded by their father in 1955.
What the boys are doing now are out of their father's file cabinets. Open up a file cabinet. Dad looked at this 28 years ago. It's amazing.
Today, Piasecki Aircraft is working with the Defense Advanced Research and Projects Agency on a project called Ares. It combines 2 of Frank's designs, utilizing ducted fans like the Air Jeep, and it is a drone like the Seabat.
Piasecki's legacy is really bringing the helicopter into the modern age.
Frank Piasecki could see the future of the helicopter. He glimpsed it as a teenager taking a ride on an autogyro, and then spent his life in pursuit of what vertical lift could do.
He was well ahead of his time from the very moment he started designing helicopters.
Frank never stopped designing until his death in 2008 at the age of 88. No aircraft bears his name, but every helicopter that rises straight up into the air and flies today has been touched by this man's energy and boundless imagination.